In a small, quiet corner of the galaxy, there was a human mechanic named Jake. He worked on a space station that was far from the center of civilization. The station was old and often quiet, filled with the hum of machines and the occasional whisper of the stars outside. Jake had been working here for years, fixing whatever broke, from engines to simple tools. He didn't mind the solitude. He liked the peace. It was the kind of life where things were predictable, and Jake had grown comfortable with that. One ordinary morning, as he was tightening bolts on a broken engine, something unusual happened. The door to his workshop opened with a soft hiss, and a small figure stumbled inside. At first, Jake didn't notice anything strange about the visitor. He thought it was just another crew member who had come to check on the repairs. But as he looked up, his heart skipped a beat. The figure was not human. It was small, with pale blue skin, large black eyes, and delicate features. It looked like a child, but there was something different about it. The child's breathing was shallow, and it moved slowly, as if in pain. Its body was covered in strange, glowing markings, and it seemed lost, confused, and frightened. Jake's first instinct was to call for help. This wasn't something he was prepared to deal with. But then he noticed the child's eyes. They were wide and filled with fear, and Jake could sense that it was not just injured, but in desperate need of help. The station's medical team was far away, and Jake knew that if he didn't do something now, the child might not survive. He quickly rushed over and knelt beside the small alien. The child flinched when he reached out, but it didn't try to move away. Jake's hands shook a little as he gently helped the child sit down on the workbench. He examined the alien's injuries. The markings on its skin seemed to be glowing even more brightly now, as if responding to the pain it was in. Jake could see that the child had been through something terrible. "I don't know what to do for you," Jake muttered, more to himself than to the child. But his voice was calm, and he knew he had to act fast. He scanned the workbench and grabbed a few tools. His mechanic training had taught him how to fix things, engines, machines, even old broken gadgets. But this was different. He didn't know anything about alien biology. Yet, as he looked into the child's eyes, he knew he couldn't turn away. Something inside him pushed him to help. Jake worked quickly, trying to patch up the child's injuries. He used the little medical supplies he had available, carefully wrapping the wounds and applying pressure where needed. He could hear the child's soft breathing slowing, and he hoped that meant he was doing something right. Minutes passed, and the child's condition seemed to improve, just a little. Jake could feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't something he should be doing. Helping an alien, a creature from another world. The station commander had always said that the station was neutral ground, but helping an alien was never something Jake had imagined doing. He didn't even know who this child was or where it had come from. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the child's survival. As Jake finished, he looked down at the child. Its eyes were still wide, but the fear seemed to have faded a little. The child's breathing was steadier, and it no longer seemed as weak. It was clear that Jake's help had made a difference. But the question remained, what would happen next? The child slowly stood up, wobbling a bit on its feet. Jake stood with it, offering support. The child didn't speak, but it gave him a look that was hard to understand. It wasn't one of gratitude, but something else. There was something in its gaze that made Jake wonder if it knew more than it let on. The child turned toward the door and started to walk away, but not without a pause. It looked back at Jake one more time. Jake felt a strange connection with the alien, even though they couldn't communicate in any way. He wasn't sure why, but there was something about the child that made him feel protective, as if he had been chosen for this moment. The door closed behind the child with a soft hiss, leaving Jake alone in the workshop. His heart raced as he thought about what had just happened. He had helped an alien. What if someone found out? What if the higher-ups found out that he had done something like this? He knew it could get him into trouble. But for some reason, Jake didn't care. He had done the right thing. The child needed help, and he had given it. For a few moments, Jake stood still, staring at the door where the child had exited. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big had just happened, but he had no idea what it meant. He went back to his workbench, trying to focus on the job at hand. But his mind kept drifting back to that small alien child. Where had it come from? Why had it been injured? And why had it come to him for help? Jake didn't know the answers, but he felt a deep sense of unease. This wasn't over. Whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The small alien child had left his workshop so suddenly, without a word, but the image of its fearful eyes stayed with him. He hadn't expected to become involved in something so strange, and now that it was over, he still couldn't understand the situation fully. What had just happened? Why had the child come to him of all people? And why did it seem like the child knew something he didn't? The next few days passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. Jake tried to focus on his work. The space station had its usual routine, and the hum of the machines filled the air again, just like before. But every time he passed through the corridors, Jake couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. It was as if the entire station was waiting for something to happen. He had always felt comfortable in his quiet, predictable life. His work was simple, and there was never much excitement. But now he found himself questioning everything. The station commander had always told him that the galaxy was a dangerous place, full of unknown species and risks. But Jake had never truly believed it. Until now. One morning, as Jake was making his way to the engine room, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. In the hallway ahead, a group of crew members stood gathered, talking in hushed tones. At first, Jake thought nothing of it, but then he noticed the look on their faces, concerned, even fearful. And as he got closer, he heard snippets of their conversation. "Did you hear about the strange child found on the lower deck?" one of the crew members whispered. "They say it was an alien," another voice added, "and it didn't belong here. No one knows where it came from." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The alien child. It had been on the station, and now it was gone. But if the crew members were talking about it, something about the situation must have been serious. His mind raced as he wondered if they knew about him helping the child. Did anyone find out? Was he in trouble? As he walked past the group, he tried to act normal, though his thoughts were far from calm. The whispering stopped when he entered the engine room, but Jake couldn't stop thinking about what he had overheard. He tried to focus on the task at hand, fixing the broken parts of an engine, but it was impossible. The child's face kept appearing in his mind. A few hours later, the tension finally broke when an unexpected visitor arrived. It wasn't a crew member. It wasn't anyone Jake recognized. The man who stepped into the engine room was tall, with sharp features, and wore a uniform that Jake had never seen before. The man's eyes scanned the room quickly, locking onto Jake. "You're Jake, the mechanic?" the man asked in a low voice. Jake nodded, unsure of what to expect. The stranger's gaze was intense, and it made Jake uneasy. "I'm Commander Core," the man continued, his voice cold and serious. "I need to speak with you about something important." Jake's stomach tightened. He had no idea what this was about, but he felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure if he was in trouble or if something more serious was at play. The commander motioned for him to follow. They walked down the long corridors of the station, far from the familiar parts where Jake worked. They reached a small private room with a large table and several chairs. The commander sat down and motioned for Jake to do the same. "This is about the child," Commander Core said, his voice firm. "We know you helped it." Jake's heart sank. So, they had found out. He couldn't believe it. His stomach twisted in knots as he sat down, his hands clammy. I didn't know what else to do," Jake stammered. "It was hurt. I couldn't just leave it there." Core looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You didn't just help any ordinary child. That was a member of a highly important alien species, one that has been at odds with the galaxy for years. You've made a serious mistake. Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't meant to get involved in something so complicated. All he had done was help, but now it seemed like he had made a choice that could bring trouble not just for him, but for the entire station. You understand the consequences, don't you? Core continued. We're not in a position to ignore this. You could have put us all in danger by aiding an unknown alien. Jake nodded slowly. He understood the gravity of the situation, even if he didn't fully understand what was going on. He had helped the child because it was the right thing to do. But now, it seemed like that act had set off a chain of events he couldn't control. Core leaned forward, his voice softening slightly. I'm not here to punish you, Jake, but I need you to understand what's coming. That child, the one you helped, is not just any ordinary being. And now, we are all involved in something much larger than we can control. You'll need to make some decisions soon. Jake's head spun. What did the commander mean? What decisions? He had just helped a child. He hadn't asked for any of this. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment he helped that alien, his life had changed forever. The quiet life he had known seemed so far away now. Everything was different. And deep down, Jake knew he couldn't go back. Days passed, and Jake found it harder to ignore the strange feeling that something big was about to happen. His life, which once seemed so simple, now felt like it was spinning out of control. Every creak and hum of the station made him uneasy, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. The quiet life he had always known now felt like a distant memory, replaced by uncertainty and confusion. It wasn't long before he received another unexpected visit. The soft hiss of the door opening interrupted his thoughts as he worked late one evening. He looked up from his workbench to find a familiar face standing in the doorway. Commander Core. Jake's heart raced. What now? Had he made another mistake? Core stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was serious, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made Jake's stomach twist. This wasn't just a routine check-in. Jake could feel that whatever the commander had to say, it was important. We need to talk, Core said, his voice low. It's about the alien child. Jake swallowed hard. He had been dreading this moment, yet part of him had been expecting it. He followed Core down the hall to the same small, private room where they had spoken last time. The tension between them was thick, like the air just before a storm. I don't know what you're hoping for, Jake, Core began once they were seated. But what you did, helping that child, it wasn't just a simple act of kindness. You've gotten yourself caught up in something far bigger than either of us. Jake stared at him, unsure how to respond. He had already heard bits and pieces about the child's true identity, but it still didn't make sense. Why had the alien child come to him? And why had it seemed so urgent, as if it knew that Jake was the one who could help? Core continued, his gaze intense. That child you helped. It's part of a royal family, one that is connected to some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. What you did has brought attention to this station, and I don't think it's the kind of attention we want. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. A royal family. This alien child wasn't just some lost traveler, it was someone important. Someone with connections to forces far beyond what Jake could imagine. You're saying I've put us in danger? Jake asked, his voice quiet but tinged with disbelief. Core nodded grimly. Not just us. The whole galaxy could be affected. There are groups who would do anything to get their hands on the child. And there are those who would be willing to destroy anything in their path to ensure that power stays in the right hands. Jake felt a wave of panic rise in him. He hadn't meant to become involved in some kind of intergalactic power struggle. All he had done was help. He hadn't asked for any of this. But as the reality of the situation began to settle in, he realized that there was no turning back. He had made his choice when he decided to help the child, and now the consequences of that decision were unfolding. Core leaned forward, his voice steady but serious. We have to prepare. A fleet is coming, and it's not going to be friendly. We've been tracking them, and they're getting closer. They want the child back, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it." Jake felt the weight of those words settle over him. A fleet. Coming here. He hadn't even begun to process what it would mean for him or for the station. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. This was something far beyond his control. The quiet, peaceful life he had known was slipping away, and in its place was a future filled with uncertainty. "I need you to understand," Core continued, "that this isn't just about the child anymore. This is about the future of the galaxy. You've already played a part in it. The question now is whether you want to stay involved, or if you want to walk away and hope it all goes away." Jake felt his stomach churn. Walk away? How could he just walk away from something like this? The child had come to him for help, and he had given it. The responsibility now seemed too great to ignore, but Jake wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences of that choice. But before he could respond, there was a sudden noise from outside the room, a low rumble, followed by a strange vibration that shook the walls. Both Jake and Core froze, exchanging worried glances. The vibrations grew stronger, and Jake could hear a low hum, like the sound of a massive engine starting up. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. Core didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and moved toward the door, his face pale. He glanced back at Jake, his expression grim. "We don't have much time," Core said, his voice low and urgent. "The fleet is here, and they're not alone." Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The fleet? So soon? He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. His life had just changed forever. The choices he had made, the risks he had taken, they were all catching up to him. And now, it seemed like there was no escaping the storm that was about to hit. The hum of the station's engines grew louder, vibrating through the walls as the room seemed to tremble under the pressure. Jake's heart was racing as he stood there, frozen, his mind racing to catch up with the gravity of the situation. The fleet that Core had warned him about, it was here. But it wasn't just a group of ships. It was an entire force, something far more intimidating than Jake had ever imagined. Core moved quickly, his face tight with concentration as he grabbed a communicator from his belt. He punched a few buttons, his eyes scanning the display. Jake could hear the faint sound of chatter in the background as the commander spoke to someone on the other end. It was all too much for Jake to process. Just days ago, he was repairing engines, tightening bolts, and living a quiet life. Now, he was standing in the middle of a high-stakes situation, and he wasn't sure what his next step should be. "This is bad, Jake," Core said finally, his voice strained. "The fleet is much larger than we expected. They've been tracking the child, and they're closing in on the station fast. We don't have much time to prepare." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of the situation sinking in. "What do we do now?" Core's eyes were dark with concern as he looked at Jake. "We need to get to the command center. There are people there who can help us, but we need to move quickly. If we don't act now, we won't have time to do anything." Jake followed Core as he led the way down the narrow corridor of the station. The place that once felt like home now seemed oppressive, each hallway more suffocating than the last. As they moved, Jake could hear the distant sounds of alarms echoing from deeper within the station. The crew members were preparing, no doubt, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was nothing they could do to stop what was coming. When they reached the command center, the atmosphere was tense. Crew members were scrambling at their stations, their faces filled with a mix of fear and determination. There was a sense of urgency in the air as people moved quickly, speaking in low voices and typing furiously on consoles. Core walked straight to the central desk where a senior officer was sitting, her face drawn tight with stress. "Commander Elara," Core said, his voice steady but edged with concern. "We have a problem." Elara looked up, her eyes narrowing as she took in the gravity of the situation. "I know. The fleet's arrival was detected hours ago. We've been tracking them, but they're moving too quickly. They're already within range. Jake's stomach dropped at the mention of the fleet. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was working frantically, trying to prepare for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation. But there was something about the way Alara looked at Kor that made Jake uneasy. It was as if there was something she wasn't telling them. "What's going to happen when they get here?" Jake asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. Alara's eyes flicked to him, and for a moment her gaze softened, but then her expression hardened again. "When they arrive, they'll demand the child. If they don't get it, they won't hesitate to take drastic measures." Jake's mind was racing. The child, the alien that he had helped, was the key to this whole situation. If they didn't find a way to protect it, everything would fall apart. But how could he possibly help? He was just a mechanic. He didn't have the skills or the knowledge to deal with a situation like this. "We've got to protect it," Kor said, his voice grim. "It's the only way to prevent this from escalating. If the fleet takes the child, it could change the balance of power in the galaxy. There's no telling what they would do with that kind of influence." Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't fully understand the political implications, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let that child fall into the wrong hands. The little being had come to him for help, and now it was up to Jake to ensure its safety, no matter the cost. "We need to find the child," Alara said, turning to Kor. "Do we know where it is?" Kor nodded, but there was a hesitation in his response. "We lost contact with it after it left Jake's workshop. It might have gone into hiding, or it could have been moved by someone else. We can't afford to waste time." Jake's mind was whirling. The child had left his workshop, but where could it have gone? He had tried to help, but now it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. What if the child was in more danger than they realized? He had to find it before it was too late. "We need a plan," Jake said, stepping forward. "If we're going to protect the child, we need to know where it is." Alara looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. "You're willing to help?" she asked. Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I didn't ask for any of this, but I can't stand by and let it happen. I helped the child once. I'll do whatever it takes to help again." Kor studied Jake for a moment, and then a slow nod followed. "All right, but we need to move fast. The fleet won't wait for us." The room buzzed with a new sense of urgency as the crew scrambled to put their plan into motion. Jake wasn't sure what the next few hours would bring, but one thing was certain. His life had changed forever. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was part of something far bigger, something that could affect the entire galaxy. As the crew worked, Jake found himself standing by the window, staring out into the vast expanse of space. The stars shimmered out there, distant and cold, and Jake wondered what would become of the station and the child. Would they be able to stop the fleet in time? Would the child be safe? He didn't know the answers, but he was determined to find out. Whatever lay ahead, Jake knew that he couldn't turn back. He had made a promise to protect the child, and he would do everything in his power to keep it safe, even if it meant risking everything he had. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. The crew of the station worked around the clock, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The fleet was getting closer, and every passing moment seemed to stretch the fragile thread of hope even thinner. It was as if they were standing on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move could send everything crashing down. Jake couldn't focus on anything else. The station, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt like a ticking time bomb. Every sound in the hallways made him jump. Every notification on his communicator sent a jolt of dread through him. Despite the chaos around him, he found himself thinking constantly about the child. Where was it now? Was it hiding, or had it been moved somewhere he couldn't find? And most importantly, was it safe? The questions swirled in his mind, but no answers came. Kor and Alara were in constant communication with the higher-ups, working out plans and contingencies, but Jake didn't have the luxury of waiting. He had promised to help the child, and he wasn't going to sit by while the rest of the crew took care of the problem. He needed to find the child on his own, before it was too late. One evening, while everyone else was occupied, Jake slipped away from the command center. He had a feeling, an instinct, that led him toward the lower levels of the station. It was a part of the station rarely used, filled with old, unused rooms and equipment. He had visited it before, during his routine maintenance checks, but he'd never thought it would become important. Now, it seemed like the only place left to search. The hallways grew darker as he descended, the lights flickering in a way that sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. His footsteps echoed in the silence, and for a moment, Jake thought he heard something else, a faint sound, like a whisper or a hum. He paused, straining his ears, but when he listened closely, all he heard was the soft hiss of the station's ventilation system. He continued down the hallway, turning corners and peering into empty rooms. His heart was racing as he searched, unsure of what he was even looking for. What if the child wasn't here? What if it had been taken already? Suddenly, a door at the end of the hall caught his eye. It was slightly ajar, and Jake felt an inexplicable pull toward it. As he approached, the faint hum grew louder, and his breath caught in his throat. It was coming from inside. He pushed the door open, his pulse quickening. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. In the far corner, Jake saw a small figure crouched down, its back to him. His heart stopped for a moment. It was the child. The alien stood still, its head slightly tilted as if listening to something that only it could hear. It was small, fragile-looking, but there was a sense of calm about it. An aura that made Jake feel like everything would be all right, if he could just protect it. "Hey," Jake whispered, careful not to startle it. The child turned its head slowly, its large, dark eyes locking with his. Jake's breath caught in his throat. There was an intelligence there, a depth that seemed far beyond what its small body should hold. And yet, despite everything, it looked scared, vulnerable. "I'm here to help," Jake said gently, stepping into the room. He lowered his voice, trying to sound reassuring. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The child didn't respond, but it slowly straightened up, watching him with a cautious expression. Jake could see that it was trembling slightly, its small body shivering despite the warmth of the room. It was scared, and Jake realized it wasn't just because of the fleet. There was something else, something deeper, that had made the child seek him out in the first place. "Are you alone?" Jake asked softly, kneeling down to the child's level. He wasn't sure if the alien could understand everything he was saying, but he hoped his tone would communicate what words couldn't. The child made a small, almost imperceptible nod, and for the first time, Jake noticed something strange. A small pendant around its neck, glowing faintly. It was shaped like a star, and the light seemed to pulse rhythmically, almost like it was alive. It reminded Jake of the way the stars looked when he gazed out from the station's observation deck. Faint, distant, but full of mystery. Jake's eyes lingered on the pendant for a moment before he returned his attention to the child. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone anymore." The child's expression softened ever so slightly, and for a brief moment, Jake thought it understood. Then, just as quickly, the air in the room seemed to shift. A low sound vibrated through the walls, distant at first, but growing louder. The hairs on the back of Jake's neck stood on end. Something was coming. His communicator buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out quickly, eyes scanning the message that had just come through. It was from Alara. "We've located the fleet. They're entering the station's orbit. We don't have much time. Get to the command center. Now." Jake's stomach churned. The fleet was here, and it was closer than he had ever imagined. There was no more time for planning. The choice was clear. He had to protect the child, no matter what. He turned to the small alien, locking eyes with it one last time. "We need to go," he said. "Come with me. It's not safe here." The child didn't hesitate. It stood up, its small form moving with surprising grace. Together, they left the room, Jake keeping a watchful eye on the hallways as they made their way toward the command center. The sound of the fleet's engines filled the air now, louder than ever. And Jake realized that this was it, the moment he had been dreading, the moment everything would change. He wasn't just trying to protect a child anymore. He was fighting for the future, for the safety of the station and everything he had ever known. Whatever lay ahead, Jake knew he couldn't back down. There was no turning back. The command center was in chaos. Jake could hear the frantic voices of the crew as they scrambled to prepare for what was coming. The fleet, now visible outside the station's windows, hovered like a dark cloud over their heads, casting a shadow over everything. Each passing moment felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the situation was crushing the very walls around them. Jake moved quickly through the crowded hallways, the child still beside him, its small hand holding tightly to the fabric of his jumpsuit. He could feel its tiny fingers trembling, and though it didn't speak, Jake knew the child was frightened. It had come to him in search of help, and now it was up to him to protect it. When they reached the command center, the air was thick with tension. Alara and Kor were already in the midst of a heated discussion with the rest of the crew, their faces grim as they analyzed the data flashing across the holographic screens in front of them. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with uncertainty, but there was a clear sense of urgency as everyone worked to devise a plan. "You made it," Kor said, his voice a mix of relief and anxiety. He glanced at the child for a brief moment, his expression softening. "We've been trying to figure out our next move. The fleet's arrival is imminent, and we don't have much time." Jake nodded, but he didn't speak. His mind was racing, and every passing second felt like it might be their last. He could see the fear in the eyes of the other crew members, but he knew that there was no time to dwell on that now. The fleet was on its way, and they needed a plan. Fast. Alara turned toward Jake, her face determined. "We need to move quickly. The fleet will expect us to hand over the child. If we don't comply, they'll find another way to get what they want." Jake's heart sank. The weight of her words hung in the air like a lead balloon. The thought of handing the child over, of betraying its trust, felt like a betrayal of everything he had promised to protect. But what choice did they have? The fleet was powerful, and their resources were vast. How could a small station stand against them? "We can't let them have it," Jake said, his voice firm. "We need to find a way to keep the child safe, no matter what." Alara studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I agree, but we can't do this alone. We need to act fast and get the child to a safe location before the fleet can force our hand." Kor stepped forward, his eyes filled with determination. "There's a hidden escape route, a series of tunnels that lead out of the station. It's not well known, and it's our best shot at getting the child out of here without being detected. We've used it before in emergencies, but it's not perfect. It's risky." Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with doubt. An escape route sounded promising, but how could they be sure it would work? How could they be sure the fleet wouldn't catch wind of their plan? "We don't have much of a choice," Jake said, his voice steady. "If the fleet finds us, we'll have no chance." Alara nodded, her jaw set in a tight line. "Then it's settled. We make our move now." The crew worked quickly, gathering supplies and preparing for the escape. Jake kept his focus on the child, making sure it was as safe as possible, though it seemed to sense the danger looming outside. It clung to him with an almost desperate urgency, its large eyes wide with uncertainty. They moved swiftly through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the station. The sounds of the fleet, still visible in the distance, only grew louder. The pressure was mounting, and every corner they turned felt like a step closer to the unknown. Jake's thoughts raced. What was the fleet after? Why was this child so important? He had no answers, but he couldn't afford to ask questions now. They had to get out. They had to find safety. As they neared the hidden exit, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too quiet. The usual hum of the station had vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. He exchanged a look with Core, who seemed to sense it too. "Something's not right," Core muttered, glancing around. His hand hovered over his weapon, ready for anything, but his face remained calm. Alara spoke in a low voice, almost to herself. "The fleet's here. They've already begun their search." Jake's heart skipped a beat. They had to move faster. Time was running out. They reached the access point to the escape tunnels, and Core quickly input the code. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow passageway that led into the station's lower levels. Without hesitation, they filed inside, the air feeling colder as they moved deeper into the tunnels. The walls of the tunnel were rough, the low lights flickering above them as they moved through the dark, winding paths. The child walked close beside Jake, and he could feel its nervous energy, its silent fear that mirrored his own. What would happen if they were caught? What would happen to the child? They moved quickly, but every step felt like an eternity. The sound of the fleet's ships, still echoing from outside, seemed to grow louder, their engines vibrating through the walls of the station. Jake couldn't help but think that every sound, every vibration, was a reminder that time was slipping through his fingers. "Keep moving," Core urged, his voice tense as he led the way. "We're almost there. Just a little further." Jake nodded, but his thoughts were scattered. The child was still holding onto him tightly, and he could feel the weight of its trust. It was as if it knew that this wasn't just about escaping. It was about survival. They rounded a corner, and in the distance, Jake could see the faint light of the tunnel's exit. Hope surged within him, but just as quickly, it was dashed. A loud crack echoed through the tunnel, followed by a distant, rumbling noise. The station shook, and for a brief moment, Jake lost his footing, grabbing onto the wall to steady himself. "What was that?" Alara hissed, her voice filled with alarm. "The fleet," Core said, his voice grim. "They've started their attack. We need to move. Now." The sound of the rumble grew louder, and the walls of the tunnel seemed to tremble under the pressure. They had no more time. If they didn't make it to the exit now, it might be too late. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the faint light ahead beckoning them onward, yet every step felt heavier. The rumbling from above grew louder, the vibrations making the walls feel as though they were about to collapse at any moment. Jake kept his grip on the child's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He had promised to protect it, and now, as they neared the exit, he couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into an even greater danger. Core, at the front of their small group, moved with urgency, his eyes scanning every dark corner of the tunnel, ready for any sign of movement. Alara was close behind, her face set in a determined expression. But Jake's thoughts were consumed by the child. It had come to him for help. And now, as the fleet's forces closed in, he had to find a way to fulfill that promise. "Not much further," Core muttered, his voice tight with stress. "We're almost there. Stay sharp." Jake nodded, but the words didn't reassure him. They weren't out of danger yet. The escape tunnel was a hidden passage, but that didn't mean it was secure. If the fleet was already searching the station, it was only a matter of time before they found this route too. The faint light ahead flickered as they moved, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living things. The child's grip tightened, and Jake looked down to find it staring up at him with those dark, haunting eyes. It didn't speak, but there was a quiet understanding between them. The child trusted him. It had to. Then, just as Jake thought they might make it to the exit, the ground beneath them trembled with another deep rumble. The walls of the tunnel seemed to shudder, and dust began to fall from the ceiling in tiny floating particles. Alara cursed under her breath. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice strained. "We don't have much time." Core was already moving faster, his steps quicker now, the tunnel's exit just within reach. Jake could see the glimmer of light through the end of the tunnel, and for a moment, he thought they might make it out. They might escape. They might be safe. But the sound of footsteps from behind made him freeze. Jake turned, his eyes narrowing as he strained to hear. There was no mistaking it. The fleet's forces were already here, searching for them, moving through the tunnels with precision. They had followed their trail. "We need to hurry," Cor said urgently, but Jake was already moving, pulling the child along with him. The sense of dread that filled him was overwhelming. The fleet had found them, and now their only chance of survival lay in getting through the exit before it was too late. They reached the tunnel's exit, but just as Jake stepped toward it, the ground beneath them trembled violently. A massive explosion rocked the station, and the walls of the tunnel cracked open, sending a shower of debris down the passage. The blast wave slammed into them, throwing Jake off balance. He stumbled, catching himself on the rocky walls, but the force of the explosion sent him to the ground. "Jake!" Alara cried, her voice filled with panic. He struggled to his feet, his heart racing. The child was still in his arms, and despite the chaos, it was safe, its small form pressed tightly against him. The blast had thrown them off course, but they couldn't afford to waste time. They had to move now. "Get to the exit," Cor shouted, his voice sharp and filled with urgency. He was already pulling himself through the wreckage, his movements quick and calculated. Jake looked toward the exit. It was just ahead, but the tunnel was crumbling around them. The explosion had made the path unstable. They wouldn't be able to get through the way they had planned. "Alara, we need another way," Jake yelled, trying to keep his voice steady. Alara, who had been scanning the tunnel for another exit, turned and nodded. "Follow me." She took off down a side passage, the way forward barely wide enough to fit through. The walls were cracked, and the ceiling hung low with jagged rocks, but it was their only option. Jake followed close behind, the child still clutched tightly in his arms. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close to freedom. The side passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing as they moved deeper into the station. Every step seemed to take them further away from safety, but Jake refused to stop. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, blocking out the sounds of the crumbling station and the distant rumble of the fleet's approach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into another large chamber. This room, unlike the others, seemed to be a storage area, filled with crates and abandoned equipment. There was another exit at the far end, but it was blocked by a pile of debris. Jake didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, clearing the rubble as quickly as he could. Cor and Alara were already at the door, working to get it open. The child was quiet now, its grip still firm on Jake's hand. He looked down at it, feeling the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on him. The child had come to him for help, and despite the danger, despite the odds, he couldn't back down. He wouldn't. With a final push, the door creaked open. The cool air of the outside world flooded in, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Jake allowed himself to breathe. They had made it. They were free. For a moment, everything stood still. The noise of the fleet's ships seemed to fade into the distance, and the station behind them felt miles away. The child, now safely out of the tunnel, stepped into the fresh air, its eyes looking around with wonder. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. They had escaped, but the journey wasn't over. There was still much to do, and the questions about the child's purpose remained unanswered. But for now, they were safe, and that was enough. As they walked away from the station, Jake knew that whatever the future held, he would face it head-on. The child had chosen him for a reason, and he wouldn't let it down. Not now. Not ever.